Hello everyone. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So, if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin the first story. I've been driving these highways for 15 years now, and most nights blend together in a rhythm of asphalt and engine hum. But there's one particular evening that still visits my dreams. A night that changed how I see the shadows between small towns. My name is Jared Maxon, and like many long-haul drivers, I've collected stories from truck stops across America. But none prepared me for what happened in Wendon, Idaho, a town so small it barely warranted a dot on most maps. The evening started typically enough. My driving partner Maurice and I had been discussing local folklore we'd heard whispered in diners and rest stops. Tales of the Red River Ripper had followed us through several states, stories of an elusive figure who haunted remote areas, leaving behind scenes that defied explanation. As darkness settled over the Idaho countryside, we found ourselves drawn to investigate an abandoned cluster of buildings near Abbott Falls, about 10 miles outside Wendon. The locals we'd spoken with had warned us away from this place, their voices dropping to whispers when they mentioned the crumbling structures hidden in the trees. Against our better judgment, we parked our rigs and approached the derelict site. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating broken boards and rusted metal. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Inside the main building, we discovered something that made my blood run cold. The walls were adorned with dark stains that looked disturbingly fresh, and scattered about were what appeared to be human remains. The scene spoke of violence, of something terrible that had taken place in this forgotten corner of the world. We were preparing to leave when we heard them, footsteps dragging across the worn floorboards, accompanied by the metallic scrape of something sharp. In that moment, every ghost story we'd ever heard seemed to crystallize into reality. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, gaunt, with clothing stained dark and a complexion that seemed to absorb the moonlight. His presence filled the room with menace, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of countless dark deeds. "You poor souls," he said, gesturing toward the macabre scene around us. "This is my art, my masterpiece. A master needs a proper canvas to bring his work alive." Morris and I backed away slowly, every instinct screaming at us to run. But before the situation could escalate further, armed townspeople burst into the room, apparently having followed us to this cursed place. What happened next defied explanation. As the locals closed in on the figure, he produced a strange device from his coat. A blinding flash filled the room, and when our vision cleared, he had vanished completely. Only a message remained on the wall. "None shall ever capture me, not while my soul remains bound to this accursed domain." We left Wendon that very night, vowing never to return. But the memory of that encounter has stayed with me through all these years of driving. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I find myself wondering if we truly witnessed something supernatural, or if we stumbled into the lair of a very human monster who had mastered the art of disappearing. The Red River Ripper, whether man or something else entirely, continues to haunt the back roads of Idaho. And though Morris and I escaped that night, I know that some mysteries are better left unsolved, some shadows better left unexplored. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. The desert highways of Nevada hold secrets that most travelers never glimpse. During my decades behind the wheel, I've learned to respect the vast emptiness, the way darkness seems to pool in places where civilization fears to tread. But one encounter taught me that sometimes the desert's secrets find you. I'm Everett Collins, and what I'm about to share happened on a stretch of road so isolated that cell towers are dreams and gas stations are miracles. It was deep into a spring night when I spotted her, an elderly woman walking alone on the shoulder, her tattered clothes whipping in the desert wind. Something about her posture, the way she moved through the darkness, should have warned me. But compassion overrode caution, and I pulled over to offer assistance. "I could use a ride," she said, in a voice like gravel grinding beneath tires. Her name, she told me, was Marjorie Jacobson, and as we drove deeper into Nevada's heart, she began to share stories that made my grip tighten on the steering wheel. She spoke of disappearances, of travelers who ventured into these desolate places and were never seen again. She mentioned the walker, a creature that roamed these roads, hunting those who didn't belong. At first, I dismissed her words as the ramblings of someone who'd spent too much time alone in the desert heat. But as we continued into the night, something began to change. The air in the cab grew thick and oppressive. I heard sounds, cracking, shifting noises that seemed to come from my passenger herself. When I glanced over, what I saw made my blood freeze. Marjorie was transforming. Her frail body was stretching, elongating into something that barely fit within the confines of my truck. Her limbs twisted at impossible angles, her back hunched into a grotesque arc. Her eyes had turned pitch black, reflecting no light, and her mouth stretched to reveal rows of teeth that no human should possess. "I am the walker," she snarled, her voice now coming from deep within her transformed throat. The creature that had been Marjorie lunged for me, but somehow I managed to keep control of the truck. Behind us, I saw the headlights of another semi approaching. Desperately, I signaled for help, and the driver responded by flashing his high beams. The sudden burst of light caused the walker to recoil, its inhuman form contracting as if in pain. In that moment of distraction, I yanked the wheel hard, sending my rig careening toward the guardrail of a bridge we were crossing. The impact threw both the walker and myself against the side of the cab. I watched in horror as the creature clawed at the passenger window, its powerful limbs breaking through, but before it could escape, it lost its grip and tumbled into the ravine below. Its scream echoed through the night, a sound that seemed to contain all the loneliness and rage of the desert itself. When the authorities arrived and searched the riverbed below, they found no trace of the walker. To this day, I'm haunted by questions. Was Marjorie Jacobson real, or was she always the creature that called itself the walker? Did I encounter something supernatural, or something worse? A human so twisted by isolation and madness that they had become something else entirely. I still drive these Nevada highways, but I'm more careful now about who I pick up. The desert is vast and full of secrets, and sometimes those secrets were the face of a harmless old woman asking for a ride. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Montana's Highwood Mountains hold a beauty that can deceive you. The encounter began innocuously enough. I was hauling cargo through a remote stretch when I came across what appeared to be a stranded motorist, a man named Clancy Geller, whose car had overheated. Clancy was an odd character, with speech patterns that seemed rehearsed and eyes that never quite met mine directly. As we drove through the increasingly desolate landscape, he began telling me strange stories about his explorations in the Highwood Mountains and signs of something that lived in the deep woods. His tales might have remained just conversation, if not for what happened next. As we rounded a bend in the road, something emerged from the thick forest that lined the highway. A large figure, standing on two legs, covered in matted fur, with eyes that glowed amber in my headlights. The stench hit us before we could fully process what we were seeing. It was the smell of decay, of something that lived between life and death. Clancy's demeanor changed instantly from nervous storyteller to something far more sinister. "That's the sheepman of Highwood Mountains," he whispered, but his voice carried excitement rather than fear. Part human, part beast, with an appetite for flesh that can never be satisfied. He was connected to it, possibly part of some cult that worshipped it. The battle in the cab was brief but violent. Clancy's knife found my shoulder and face, leaving shallow cuts that burned like fire. I drove without stopping until I reached a gas station 30 miles south, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. The old-timer who helped clean my wounds told me the rest of the story. Clancy Geller was an escaped convict with a history of brutal killings. But more than that, he was part of a group that worshipped the sheepman, treating it as some kind of dark deity that demanded blood sacrifice. The creature itself remained a mystery. Some said it was the result of ancient rituals gone wrong. Others believed it was a guardian spirit that had been corrupted by human violence. The truth, whatever it was, seemed less important than the fact that it was real, and it was still out there. Even now, years later, when I drive through the Highwood Mountains, I feel its presence. On quiet nights, I hear whispers in the wind and catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. The sheepman may be a legend to most people, but to me, it's a reminder that some places in this world are older and darker than we can comprehend. I still don't know what happened to Clancy Geller that night, whether the creature claimed him or whether he's still out there serving his monstrous master. But sometimes, in the deepest part of the forest, let's dive into the next disturbing story. Wyoming's wilderness holds secrets that predate any human settlement. I'm Renard, and I've been driving these mountain roads for 15 years. Darby Canyon was always one of my favorite routes, narrow and winding, but peaceful, with views that could make you believe in something greater than yourself. That changed after what happened on a cold October evening when the first snow was beginning to dust the high peaks. My CB radio crackled with a familiar voice. My coworker, Salem Grimes, who was running a parallel route about 20 miles north. His news was unsettling. Hikers had gone missing in the canyon, and search teams had found evidence of something that didn't fit any normal explanation. As I wound deeper into the canyon, the silence grew oppressive. Usually, these mountains were alive with the sounds of wildlife. But tonight, there was nothing, not even the whisper of wind through the trees. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I stopped for fuel at an old gas station that sat like a forgotten outpost at the canyon's edge. The attendant, an elderly man with weathered hands and worried eyes, mentioned the local legend when he saw my nervous glances toward the tree-line Wendigo. He said simply, as if that one word explained everything. Been stories about it for generations. Thing that was once human, but hunger changed it into something else. Something that can never be satisfied. I tried to dismiss his words as folklore, but as I continued my route, Salem's voice came over the radio again. This time, There was fear in his transmission. They'd found human remains near Sparrow Creek. What was left of them, anyway? The injuries weren't consistent with any known predator. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement in my headlights, something large and pale that crossed the road with impossible speed. I swerved instinctively, my truck skidding to a stop on the shoulder as my heart hammered against my ribs. Its skin was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over protruding bones. But it was the eyes that nearly broke my sanity. Black pits that seemed to contain an endless, gnawing hunger. The Wendigo, for that's what it was. I knew it in my bones. Let out a sound that will haunt me until I die. Part scream, part howl, part the moan of something that had once been human, but remembered only the ache of never being full, never being satisfied. I grabbed my shotgun and fired a warning shot into the air. The creature paused, its massive head tilting as it studied me with those terrible eyes. For a moment, I thought it might retreat. Instead, it vanished. Not by running, but by seeming to fold into the darkness itself. I radioed Salem immediately, but got only static. It wasn't until later that I learned his truck had been found abandoned, the cab torn open from the inside, with no sign of my friend except for dark stains on the seat and dashboard. The search that followed was extensive but fruitless. The Wendigo had vanished as completely as if it had never existed, leaving behind only questions and the kind of fear that settles into your bones and never fully leaves. I continued driving through Darby Canyon, but never alone and never at night. The gas station attendant's words stayed with me. The Wendigo was once human, transformed by a hunger so profound it rewrote the very essence of what they were. In those dark moments before sleep, I sometimes wondered if Salem was still out there somewhere, changed, hunting, never satisfied. The canyon looks the same as it always did, beautiful, serene, touched by something ancient and wild. But now I know that beauty can hide horrors, and that some hungers are so deep they can remake you into something else entirely. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. The Mojave Desert has always been a place where reality seems negotiable, where heat mirages make the impossible look commonplace, and vast distances play tricks with perception. But what I encountered on a moonlit stretch of California highway challenged more than just my understanding of physics. It tested my faith in the boundary between nightmare and waking life. My name is unimportant now. What matters is the story I need to tell, the warning I need to share about the figure locals call the Stitchman. I was hauling electronics to Flagstaff when I first heard his name whispered in a desert truck stop, where drivers spoke in hushed tones about a creature that prowled the emptiest stretches of highway. The night I met him, the moon was nearly full, casting the desert in silver shadows that seemed to move with their own purpose. I was making good time on a familiar route when something appeared in my headlights, a figure standing impossibly still beside the road, as if he'd been waiting specifically for me. At first glance, he appeared to be just another stranded traveler, the kind you encounter occasionally in the desert's remote places. But as my headlights illuminated him more clearly, details emerged that made my skin crawl. His face seemed assembled from different pieces, as if someone had taken various features and stitched them together with coarse, dark thread. The pattern extended to his exposed arms and neck, rough sutures holding together patches of skin that didn't quite match in tone or texture. Some of the stitching appeared fresh, the thread dark with what I hoped was just desert dirt. but suspected was something more sinister. He moved with jerky, unnatural motions, like a marionette controlled by a drunk puppeteer. When he raised his hand to flag me down, I could see that his fingers, too, bore the marks of surgical intervention, some too long, others bent at angles that human joints couldn't naturally achieve. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving, but something about his posture, the way he stood perfectly centered in my headlights, suggested that ignoring him wasn't really an option. As I slowed, he approached the passenger side of my cab with movements that reminded me of a predator playing with wounded prey. "Lost?" he asked, his voice a patchwork of different tones and accents, as if it too had been assembled from various sources. Up close, his face was even more disturbing. One eye blue, one brown, a nose that seemed to belong to a different skull entirely, and a mouth that curved in a smile revealing teeth of wildly different shapes and conditions. I tried to maintain composure, to treat this as just another strange encounter on the highways of America. But when he reached for the door handle, I saw that his hands bore not just stitches, but actual surgical clamps, as if whoever had assembled him had run out of thread and improvised with medical hardware. "I help people," he continued, his mismatched voice carrying notes of genuine enthusiasm that were somehow more terrifying than any threat. "Fix them, improve them, make them better than they were." The interior light revealed more details I wished I couldn't see. His clothing was a patchwork of different fabrics and styles, held together with the same crude stitching that decorated his flesh. Beneath the cloth, I could see the outline of surgical scars, places where pieces of different people had been joined to create this walking nightmare. He began telling me about his work, describing with clinical detachment how he'd perfected his craft over years of practice in the desert's hidden places. He spoke of travelers who'd broken down, people who'd wandered too far from safety, individuals who'd made the mistake of accepting help from a stranger who promised to fix whatever was wrong with them. As he talked, I noticed that some of his stitches were fresh, seeping slightly in the dry desert air. His most recent work, perhaps, additions acquired from other midnight encounters on lonely highways. The realization that I was likely intended to be his next project gave me the surge of adrenaline I needed to act. When he leaned forward to examine my face more closely, muttering something about good bone structure and excellent proportions, I grabbed the tire iron from beneath my seat and swung with everything I had. The impact sent him sprawling, dark fluid spattering across the desert sand. But instead of crying out in pain, he laughed, a sound that mixed genuine mirth with mechanical grinding, as if parts of his throat had been replaced with clockwork. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I floored the accelerator and left him in a cloud of dust, his laughter echoing across the desert until distance finally swallowed it. Later investigation revealed that the stitchman was likely Dr. Marcus Holloway, a surgeon who disappeared into the Mojave years earlier after losing his medical license for conducting unauthorized experiments. Whether he'd gone mad from isolation or had been practicing his twisted craft from the beginning remained unclear. What was certain was that he was still out there, somewhere in the vast emptiness of the desert, continuing his work. Travelers still occasionally report encounters with a stitched-together figure who offers help with mechanical problems, medical emergencies, or simple loneliness. Those who accept his assistance are never seen again, though locals sometimes find clothing and personal effects scattered across the sand, as if their owners had simply vanished. I still drive desert highways, but I've learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. The Mojave is vast enough to hide secrets, empty enough to swallow screams, and lonely enough to drive people to madness. And somewhere out there, the Stitchman continues his work, assembling new creations from the parts of those unlucky enough to cross his path on clear desert nights. When the moon is full and the shadows seem to move with purpose, I sometimes catch glimpses of figures standing beside distant roads, but I never slow down to investigate, never stop to offer help, because I know that in the Mojave Desert, sometimes the person offering assistance is the last person you'd ever want to meet. Let's dive in to the next disturbing story. I've always been a rational person, the kind who looks for logical explanations before considering anything unusual. 23 years of long-haul trucking teaches you to separate fact from fiction, reality from road-weary imagination. But what happened on those Ohio backroads challenged everything I thought. I knew about the boundaries between the explainable and the impossible. My name is Merrick Van Doren, and I need to share this experience, not to convince anyone of anything supernatural, but to document something that fundamentally shifted my understanding of what might be possible on America's forgotten highways. It started at a truck stop in Oakwood, where I met Zorian Caldwell, another driver who'd been working these routes longer than most. Over greasy breakfast plates, Zorian shared stories that made my coffee grow cold. Tales of a figure the local law enforcement had dubbed the Highway Reaper, someone or something that had been stalking truck drivers on isolated roads for decades. The pattern was always similar: headlights following at a distance, never overtaking, never turning off. Drivers who pulled over found themselves confronted by a figure with a sawed-off shotgun, moving with an unnatural stealth that defied explanation. Most encounters ended badly, very badly. I'll admit I was skeptical. Road stories tend to grow in the telling, and after enough coffee and not enough sleep, any shadow can become a monster. But Zorian's eyes held something I recognized from my own mirror after particularly difficult runs, the look of someone who'd seen something they couldn't quite process. That night, driving through the darkened Ohio countryside, I found myself checking my mirrors more frequently than usual. The rational part of my mind insisted this was simply suggestion, the power of a well-told story to plant seeds of paranoia. But as the miles passed, I became increasingly aware that the same set of headlights had been behind me for over an hour. The vehicle maintained a perfect distance, close enough to be noticeable, far enough away to remain anonymous. When I changed lanes, it changed lanes. When I adjusted my speed, it adjusted accordingly. The precision of its movements felt deliberate, almost predatory. At a rest stop near the Indiana border, I pulled over, hoping whoever was following would continue past instead. The headlights pulled in behind me, maintaining that careful distance. My hands were shaking as I reached for my CB radio to call for help, but the airwaves were filled with static, an electronic silence that felt wrong in its completeness. The figure that approached my truck moved with a fluidity that seemed to defy normal human locomotion. In the amber glow of the parking lot lights, I could make out a tall, gaunt silhouette carrying what appeared to be a shortened firearm. But there was something about the way he moved, too smooth, too quiet, as if his feet barely touched the ground. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice cracking with fear I couldn't suppress. The response came not as words, but as a presence, a weight in the air that made breathing difficult. The figure raised its weapon, and I found myself staring into darkness that seemed deeper than the surrounding night. What happened next saved my life, though I'm still not entirely sure how. Headlights suddenly illuminated the scene. Another truck pulling into the rest area. The figure turned toward the newcomer, and in that moment of distraction, I saw something that challenges everything I understand about human physiology. His face, illuminated by the harsh glare of headlights, appeared wrong somehow. The proportions were human, but exaggerated, as if someone had taken a normal person and stretched them like taffy. His eyes reflected light like an animal's, and when he moved his head, the motion was too fluid, lacking the natural limitations of human neck muscles. The arriving trucker was Zorian himself, who later told me he'd been monitoring CB chatter and heard the unusual static patterns. His presence seemed to break whatever spell had held the scene frozen. The Highway Reaper, for that's what he was. I knew it with certainty, retreated into the darkness with movements that looked more like liquid flowing than walking. We called the police, of course, but by the time they arrived, there was nothing to find except our testimonies and a patch of asphalt that seemed slightly warmer than the surrounding pavement. The officers were professional but skeptical, filing a report that would join dozens of similar accounts stretching back decades. In the weeks that followed, Zorian and I compared our experiences with other drivers who'd encountered the Highway Reaper. The stories were remarkably consistent. The patient stalking, the unnatural movement, the way electronic equipment malfunctioned in his presence, and most disturbing of all, the sense that this wasn't entirely human anymore, if it ever had been. Some drivers theorized it was a person who'd been changed by years of isolation and violence, their humanity gradually eroding until only predatory instinct remained. Others suggested something more supernatural, a spirit of the highway itself, fed by the loneliness and desperation that accumulates on America's forgotten roads. I don't know which explanation I prefer. What I do know is that the Highway Reaper is still out there, still following lone drivers through the darkness. I've managed to photograph him twice since our first encounter. Blurry images that show a tall figure but seem to resist focus, as if cameras can't quite capture whatever he's become. I still drive the Ohio routes, but I'm more careful now. I travel with others when possible, maintain contact with dispatch, and trust my instincts when something feels wrong, because I've learned that the highways hold secrets we're not meant to understand. And sometimes those secrets take the form of something that was once human, but has become something else entirely. The rational part of my mind still searches for logical explanations. A serial killer with advanced technology, elaborate hoaxes, mass hallucination brought on by isolation and stress. But late at night, when the road stretches empty ahead and my mirrors show only darkness, I remember the way he moved, the way electronics failed in his presence, and the certainty that I was looking at something that existed at the edge of what we consider possible. I'm sharing this not to frighten anyone, but to document an experience that changed how I understand the world. The Highway Reaper may be one person's delusion or many people's shared nightmare. But until we understand what he really is, those of us who drive these lonely roads will continue to watch our mirrors and trust our instincts, knowing that some encounters can't be explained, only survived. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. There are things in the American Southwest that predate our understanding. Legends that persist not because they're comfortable to believe, but because they refuse to be forgotten. My encounter with one of these ancient mysteries happened on a stretch of Arizona highway, so remote that cell towers are distant dreams, and the next human being might be 100 miles away. I'm Bastian Lockhart, and I've been hauling cargo through the desert for over a decade. These vast, empty spaces have always felt like home to me, places where you can drive for hours without seeing another soul, where the horizon stretches impossibly far and the night sky reveals stars invisible in populated areas. But that sense of peaceful isolation was shattered during a delivery run through Holbrook, near the petrified forest. It was one of those perfect desert evenings where the sky bleeds from gold to deep purple, and the first stars begin to appear like pinpricks in dark fabric. I was making good time when my radio crackled with a familiar voice. Delmore, another driver working the same route. His news was unsettling. Another trucker, Kirk, had disappeared. His truck was found abandoned off Route 150, damaged, as if something had attacked it from the outside. No sign of Kirk himself, just blood and the kind of claw marks that don't match any known animal in the region. As Delmore's voice faded into static, I found myself paying closer attention to the landscape around me. The painted desert has always been a place where shadows play tricks, where heat mirages make the impossible look commonplace. But tonight, something felt different, a weight in the air, a sense that I was being observed by something that understood these ancient lands better than I ever could. The encounter began as movement at the edge of my vision, something large and dark that seemed to pace my truck just beyond the reach of my headlights. At first, I convinced myself it was imagination, the product of too many hours alone with desert folklore and trucker ghost stories. But the presence persisted, sometimes visible as a shadow against the star-filled sky, sometimes felt as a prickling awareness between my shoulder blades. When it finally revealed itself, the sight challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The creature that bounded across my headlights appeared to be a massive canine, larger than any wolf or coyote I'd ever seen, with fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But there was something wrong with its proportions, something that made my rational mind struggle to process what I was seeing. Its legs were too long, its torso too narrow, and when it turned to look directly at me, its eyes held an intelligence that felt uncomfortably human. For a terrifying moment, those eyes seemed to recognize me, to assess me as both threat and potential prey. The creature, I couldn't bring myself to call it an animal anymore, began to run alongside my truck, matching my speed with an ease that defied physics. It moved with a fluid grace that reminded me uncomfortably of a person pretending to be a dog, rather than an actual canine in its natural element. My hands were shaking as I reached for my radio, trying to raise Delmore or any other driver who might be in range. But the airwaves were filled with an electronic silence that felt deliberate, as if something was actively interfering with communication. Then I remembered the stories, Navajo legends about Ye-Naldlushi beings that could take the form of animals while retaining human consciousness and intent. Skinwalkers, the old-timers called them, though they usually spoke the word in whispers, as if naming such things might draw their attention. The creature running beside my truck began to change as I watched, its form becoming more fluid, more adaptable. One moment, it appeared to be a massive wolf. The next, something that might have been a large cat. Then something else entirely, as if it was cycling through different animal forms. testing which one might serve its purpose best. I pressed harder on the accelerator, but the thing matched my increased speed effortlessly. Worse, it began to move closer to my truck, occasionally reaching out with what might have been paws, or might have been something more disturbingly human-like, to scrape against my trailer. The sound of claws on metal sent chills through me, not just because of the physical threat, but because of what it implied. This wasn't random animal behavior. It was deliberate, intelligent, designed to terrorize. Whatever was out there was enjoying my fear. Just when I thought the situation couldn't become more surreal, the creature did something that made my blood freeze. It began to speak, not in any human language, but in a series of sounds that seemed designed to mimic human communication. The rhythm was almost conversational, as if it was trying to tell me something, or perhaps taunting me in a language I couldn't understand. The encounter ended as suddenly as it began. As we approached a small town, nothing more than a gas station and a few houses, the creature veered away from my truck and vanished into the desert darkness. One moment it was there, the next gone, leaving me to wonder if the entire experience had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But the scratches on my trailer were real enough, deep gouges in the metal that no ordinary animal could have made. And the fear that settled into my bones was real too. A bone-deep understanding that I had encountered something that existed outside the boundaries of what most people consider possible. I spent hours researching after that night, reading everything I could find about skinwalker legends, trying to understand what I might have encountered. The stories were remarkably consistent across different sources. Beings that had once been human but had crossed certain lines, violated certain taboos, and in doing so had gained the ability to take animal form while retaining human intelligence and malevolence. Whether what I encountered was truly supernatural or simply an unknown species that had learned to exploit human fears, I can't say. What I can say is that the desert holds secrets we're not meant to understand. And sometimes those secrets reveal themselves to travelers foolish enough to venture into places where ancient powers still hold sway. I still drive through Arizona, but I'm more respectful now of the old warnings, the traditional boundaries that indigenous peoples established for good reasons. The desert is vast and beautiful, but it's also dangerous in ways that extend far beyond rattlesnakes and flash floods. And sometimes, on those perfect desert evenings when the sky bleeds gold and the stars begin to appear, I catch myself checking my mirrors more frequently than necessary, watching for shadows that move too smoothly, too intelligently, too much like something that remembers being human, but has chosen to become something else entirely. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. There's something uniquely unsettling about Nebraska's sand hills at night. Those rolling dunes that stretch endlessly under star-filled skies create a landscape so alien you might forget you're still on Earth. It's a place where sound carries strangely, where shadows seem deeper than they should be, and where the very emptiness can play tricks on your mind. I'm sharing this experience not to prove anything supernatural exists, but to document something that happened to me on a September night that still visits my dreams. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I encountered in those vast, lonely spaces. I was hauling cargo toward Broken Bow when my CB radio crackled with a warning from another driver about an hour ahead. His voice carried an edge I recognized from my own darkest moments on the road. That particular tension that comes when you've seen something that doesn't fit into your normal understanding of the world. Fair warning there, Road Ranger, he said, static, punctuating his words. Just spotted something strange, off Route 83, about 7 miles south of Thetford. Can't say what it was, but keep your eyes open. As I approached the area he'd described, the atmosphere seemed to change. The usual sounds of the highway, wind rushing past my cab, the steady hum of tires on asphalt seemed muted, as if something was absorbing sound from the environment. Even my radio went quiet, not with static, but with a silence that felt deliberate. My headlights illuminated what appeared to be roadkill at first. A deer carcass sprawled beside the highway, but as I got closer, the extent of the damage became clear. The animal had been torn apart with a violence that went beyond normal predation. Pieces were scattered across a wide area, and the sandy soil was dark with blood that looked disturbingly fresh. That's when I saw the movement. Something large and dark darted across the road directly in front of my truck, too fast to make out clearly, but substantial enough that I swerved instinctively to avoid collision. My rig shuddered to a stop as my heart hammered against my ribs, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. The rational part of my mind immediately began offering explanations. A large dog that had escaped from somewhere, maybe a coyote made bold by hunger, possibly even a small bear that had wandered farther east than usual. But none of those explanations felt adequate when I heard the sound it made. It started as a low growl that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, echoing off the dunes in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. But then it changed, rising in pitch and intensity until it became something between a howl and a scream, a sound that seemed designed to trigger every primitive fear response evolution had built into human DNA. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cab, though every instinct screamed at me to stay locked safely inside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing disturbed sand and what looked like tracks, but tracks unlike anything I'd seen before. They were roughly canine in shape, but far too large, with claw marks that gouged deep into the hard-packed earth. The howling came again, closer this time, and I caught a glimpse of something moving just beyond my flashlight's reach. What I saw challenged my understanding of normal animal behavior. The shape was roughly wolf-like, but wrong in proportions. Too tall, too angular, moving with a gait that seemed more human than animal. As I watched, frozen in place by a mixture of fascination and terror, the creature began to circle my truck at a distance, staying just at the edge of visibility. Its movements were deliberate, intelligent, as if it was studying me as carefully as I was trying to study it. The encounter might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of another truck. As headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, the creature, whatever it was, let out one final bone-chilling howl and vanished into the rolling dunes as if it had never been there at all. The other driver was a local who knew the area well. When I described what I'd seen, his expression grew serious in a way that told me this wasn't the first such report he'd heard. "Howler of Thetford," he said simply, as if those 4 words explained everything. Been stories about it for years. Something that hunts these hills at night. Something that doesn't quite fit into any normal category. He told me about other encounters. Truckers who'd reported seeing something stalking them through the sandhills. Ranchers who'd found livestock killed in ways that didn't match known predators. campers who'd heard sounds that made them pack up in the middle of the night and drive until they reached populated areas. The official explanations were predictable: coyotes, wild dogs, maybe a mountain lion that had wandered far from its normal territory. But those of us who'd encountered the howler knew that conventional explanations fell short. There was something about its behavior, its apparent intelligence, the way it seemed to understand and exploit human fears, that suggested something more complex. I spent months researching after that night, reading everything I could find about unexplained animal sightings in the Sandhills region. The reports stretched back decades, describing a creature that seemed to exist at the boundary between known wildlife and something else entirely. Some accounts suggested it might be a cryptid, an unknown species that had adapted perfectly to the vast, empty landscape of the Sandhills. Others proposed more supernatural explanations, drawing on Native American legends about shapeshifters and spirits that took animal form. I never found a definitive answer, and perhaps that's appropriate. The Sandhills are a place where mystery feels natural, where the vastness of the landscape makes you acutely aware of how much we still don't know about the world around us. I still drive through Nebraska regularly, and I've had several more encounters with the howler over the years. Each one leaves me with the same mixture of awe and unease, the recognition that I've glimpsed something that exists outside our normal categories of understanding. The most recent encounter was just last month. I was driving the same route on another clear night when I saw it again, a dark shape moving parallel to my truck, keeping pace with effortless grace. This time, I had my phone ready and managed to capture a few seconds of video. The footage is frustratingly ambiguous, a dark shape moving against an even darker background, impossible to analyze definitively. But it's enough to remind me that the mystery continues, that whatever stalks the Sandhills at night is still out there, still defying our attempts to categorize and understand it. I share this not to convince anyone of anything in particular, but to document experiences that suggest our world might be more complex and mysterious than we typically assume. The howler of Thetford may be an unknown animal, a trick of perception, or something else entirely. What matters is that it represents the enduring power of mystery in our increasingly explained and cataloged world. And on those perfect Nebraska nights, when the stars seem close enough to touch and the Sandhills roll away into infinity, I find myself grateful for that mystery, even as it unsettles me. Some things, perhaps, are meant to remain at the edges of our understanding, reminding us that wonder still exists in unexpected places. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. The Pacific Northwest has always felt like a place where the boundaries between reality and legend blur more easily than elsewhere. Dense forests that swallow sound, mountain peaks that disappear into perpetual mist, and valleys where morning fog lingers well into afternoon. It's landscape that seems designed for mystery. My encounter with what locals call the Black Thing happened on what should have been an ordinary September morning in 1998. I'm Jedrick Malkowski, and I've been hauling freight through these mountain passes for most of my adult life. I thought I knew these roads, understood their rhythms and dangers. But that morning near Elma, Washington, taught me that familiarity doesn't necessarily equal understanding. I'd been driving since midnight, making good time through the winding highways that connect the scattered communities of western Washington. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows through the towering Douglas firs that line these roots like cathedral walls. It should have been peaceful, the kind of morning that reminds you why you chose a profession that lets you witness the country's quiet moments. Instead, something felt wrong from the moment I pulled into the rest area just outside Elma. The normal sounds of morning, birds singing, wind through the trees, the distant hum of highway traffic were absent. The silence was so complete it felt oppressive, as if something had drained all life from the surrounding forest. At first, I attributed the unease to fatigue. Long-haul driving can play tricks on your perception, make you see threats where none exist. But as I stepped out of my cab to stretch and inspect my rig, I noticed details that my rational mind struggled to dismiss. Deep gouges in the bark of nearby trees, too high and too wide to be made by any animal I knew inhabited these forests. Claw marks that looked fresh, with sap still oozing from the wounds. The ground around the trees was disturbed, showing signs of something large and powerful that had been digging or thrashing in apparent agitation. I was examining these marks when I heard other truckers at a nearby diner discussing something in hushed, worried tones. They spoke of attacks that had been happening throughout the Pacific Northwest, incidents that law enforcement couldn't adequately explain, involving damage that didn't match known predators. One driver mentioned a name that made the others go quiet. Melissa Cheeto, what some indigenous communities called the Black Thing. He described it as something that existed at the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds, a being that took animal form but possessed intelligence and malevolence, that suggested something far more complex than ordinary wildlife. I might have dismissed these conversations as typical trucker folklore, if not for what happened next. As I was preparing to leave the diner, heading back to my truck in the early morning light, I witnessed something that challenged every assumption I had about what was possible in the natural world. Another trucker was performing his pre-trip inspection when something emerged from the tree line. At first glance, it appeared to be a large dog or wolf, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too angular, with limbs that seemed to bend at impossible angles. Its fur was so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a shape that was difficult for the eye to focus on clearly. But it was the creature's behavior that truly unsettled me. It didn't move like a wild animal driven by instinct or hunger. Instead, its actions seemed calculated, intelligent, as if it was studying the human before it with the same analytical detachment that a scientist might observe a laboratory specimen. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. The creature's massive jaws closed on the truck's cab with a force that crumpled metal-like paper. But rather than continue the assault, it seemed to pause, as if savoring the terror it had created before retreating into the forest as suddenly as it had appeared. The trucker survived, though he was never quite the same afterward. His description of the encounter matched others I would hear over the following months, accounts of something that seemed to blend the physical reality of a large predator with behavioral characteristics that suggested supernatural intelligence. I began collecting these stories, not as a believer in the paranormal, but as someone trying to understand a pattern of experiences that defied conventional explanation. The accounts were remarkably consistent. Encounters with a creature that appeared to be a large, dark canine, but displayed intelligence and strategic thinking that went far beyond normal animal behavior. Some witnesses described eyes that seemed almost human in their expressiveness, as if looking into them revealed a consciousness that was aware of its own predatory nature and took pleasure in the fear it generated. Others spoke of the way it seemed to understand human technology and behavior, using this knowledge to maximize the psychological impact of its encounters. The most unsettling aspect of these accounts was the suggestion that the black thing wasn't simply a predator seeking food, but something that fed on fear and confusion. Witnesses often reported that it would stalk them for extended periods, allowing glimpses of itself just long enough to generate terror before disappearing again. My own subsequent encounters with the creature have been brief but profound. I've seen it 3 more times over the years, always at the edge of dense forest, always watching with that unnervingly intelligent gaze. Each encounter has left me with the same questions. What is it? Where did it come from? And what does it want from us? The scientific part of my mind continues to search for rational explanations. A new species, perhaps, or a known animal exhibiting unusual behavior due to environmental pressures. But the part of me that experienced those encounters knows that conventional categories may not be adequate to explain what roams the forests of the Pacific Northwest. I've learned to respect the warnings that indigenous communities have shared about certain places and certain times when the boundaries between worlds become permeable. The black thing may be a creature of flesh and blood, or it may be something else entirely, a manifestation of the wild spaces that resist human understanding and control. What I can say with certainty is that my encounters have changed how I understand the relationship between the known and unknown. The forests of Washington State are vast and deep, filled with places where human presence is rare and ancient patterns still hold sway. In such places, it's possible that things exist which don't fit neatly into our modern understanding of what is real and what is not. I continue to drive these routes because they're part of my livelihood, and because, despite the unease they sometimes bring, they've taught me to appreciate mystery in a world that increasingly offers few genuine surprises. The black thing of Elma may be a cryptid, a spirit, or simply an unusual animal, but it represents something important. The recognition that our world still holds secrets, and that wonder, even unsettling wonder, continues to exist in unexpected places. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Route 50 through Nevada earned its nickname, the loneliest road in America, honestly. There are stretches where you can drive for hours without seeing another vehicle, where the horizon seems impossibly distant, and where the silence is so complete it becomes a presence unto itself. It's in places like these that unusual experiences seem more possible, as if the very emptiness creates space for things that don't normally intrude into our everyday reality. I'm Salem Rosenwood, and I need to document something that happened at Cold Spring Station, an encounter that challenged my understanding of what might be possible in those vast, empty spaces between Nevada's scattered communities. Cold Spring Station sits like a forgotten monument along Highway 50, a weathered remnant of the old Pony Express route that once connected the far reaches of the American West. The building itself is weathered and partially boarded up, surrounded by the kind of desolation that makes you acutely aware of how far you are from anything resembling civilization. I'd stopped there during a routine haul, planning to rest for a few hours before continuing east. My companion was Lyrica, a fellow traveler I'd met at a previous stop, and her husband, Harvey. They were making their way across country in their own vehicle, and we'd agreed to travel together for safety and companionship. through the lonelier stretches of highway. Harvey had been exploring the area around the station while I checked my rig, and he returned with an old book he'd found discarded near the dried creek bed that had once provided water to travelers. The book was filled with symbols and text that none of us could decipher. But something about the markings felt significant, as if they were meant to serve as warnings rather than mere decoration. As we compared the symbols in the book to markings Harvey had noticed painted on rocks around the station, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The symbols appeared to be protective wards, designed to keep something at bay. But what, and from where? Our answer came with the darkness. The first scream echoed across the desert, just as we'd settled around our small campfire. It was a sound of pure terror, the kind that reaches into your spine and triggers responses that evolution programmed into us long before we developed rational thought. The voice was human, but it carried a quality of desperation that suggested something far worse than ordinary danger. We immediately tried to radio for help, but the airwaves were filled with static and broken communications from other drivers, describing similar sounds and reports of people simply vanishing from their vehicles. It was as if the entire stretch of highway had become a hunting ground for something we couldn't identify or understand. That's when we saw it, a figure moving in the darkness beyond our firelight. At first glance, it appeared human in shape and size, but something about its proportions and movement pattern suggested otherwise. It was too tall, too thin, and it moved with a fluidity that reminded me uncomfortably of a predator testing the boundaries of its territory. The creature, for that's what it was, despite its vaguely human appearance, seemed drawn to our fire, but reluctant to approach directly. Instead, it circled our small camp at a distance, occasionally making sounds that might have been attempts at communication or might have been something more sinister. Harvey recognized it from descriptions in the book he'd found. Tayo, he whispered, using a word from indigenous folklore that described beings that existed at the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds. Entities that had once been human but had been transformed by experiences or choices that stripped away their humanity, while leaving behind something that remembered what it had once been. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and terrifying. The Tayo moved with impossible speed, reaching our camp before any of us could react effectively. Its appearance up close was even more disturbing than at a distance, humanoid but elongated, with features that seemed to shift in the firelight, as if its physical form wasn't entirely stable. But what struck me most was its eyes. They held an intelligence that was undeniably human, but twisted by experiences I couldn't imagine. It looked at us not with animal hunger, but with something more complex. Recognition, perhaps, or a terrible longing for something it could never reclaim. The ancient symbols that Harvey had been studying proved to be more than mere decoration. Working from the instructions in the book, Lyrica began creating protective barriers using materials we found around the abandoned station, local minerals, plant matter, and markings made according to patterns that seemed to resonate with something deeper than conscious understanding. The ritual, if that's what it was, created a barrier that the Tayo couldn't cross. It raged and tested the boundaries we'd created, but couldn't breach whatever protection the old symbols had established. As dawn approached, the creature gradually faded back into the desert landscape, leaving us shaken but alive. What we experienced at Cold Spring Station has never been officially documented or explained. The protective symbols remain around the old station, and travelers who know what to look for can still see evidence of the barriers we created that night. But most people pass by without ever knowing. What once tested the boundaries between the known and unknown in that forgotten place? I've researched the history of Cold Spring Station since that encounter, learning about the indigenous communities that once considered it a place where worlds touched, where beings could cross between different states of existence. The old Pony Express riders reported strange encounters there, and later travelers left their own accounts of experiences that defied rational explanation. The Tayo may have been a creature of folklore, a manifestation of the psychological effects of extreme isolation, or something else entirely. What matters is that our encounter taught me to respect the warnings that earlier travelers had left behind, to understand that some places hold energies and possibilities that don't fit into our modern categories of understanding. I still travel Route 50 regularly, and I always stop at Cold Spring Station to check that the protective symbols remain intact. Not because I fully understand what they do, but because I've learned that some knowledge is preserved through practice rather than theory, and that respect for mystery can be a form of protection in itself. The loneliest road in America earned its name through emptiness, but that emptiness isn't always vacant. Sometimes it's filled with possibilities we're not equipped to understand, encounters that remind us that our world is far stranger and more complex than we typically acknowledge. And in places like Cold Spring Station, where the boundaries between past and present, known and unknown, seem more permeable, it's possible to glimpse realities that exist just beyond the edge of our everyday experience.